Okay. Thank you, Scott. I didn't have my microphone on. So, okay, in our last segment, we had been talking about translations of the Bible, and I'd been talking about problems of translation and therefore problems of interpretation, which come from the fact that things are translated in the first place, which are themselves interpretations of original texts. And we get into all kinds of interesting difficulties, and these difficulties may not cause us a lot of trouble in some contexts, but in others they do. And in the history of biblical translation, that history has often been a very troubled and contentious history. And I had been talking a little bit about the similarities and differences among these different translations, but I should also point out that while all of these are very, very important, the one which has had the greatest impact on the development of English literature has been the authorized version of 1611, or what is generally called the King James Version of the Bible. And the reason why is that from the early 17th century onward, this was the Bible that virtually all English people would have known. Even if you were a Catholic, this would have been the Bible that you heard quoted all the time. And certainly if you were an English Protestant, you would have encountered this constantly. You probably would have read it yourself, assuming that you could get the kind of education or tutoring so that you could learn to read it for yourself. And you would certainly hear it quoted, and not simply in sermons in church, but all over the place, by writers, by politicians, by the aristocracy, by the ruling classes, on the streets, in the home. Biblical phrases, proverbs, and so forth became just commonplace. And so you hear echoes of this biblical language all over in English poetry for the next several centuries. And the next major poet we're going to take up is John Milton, and of course, we're going to be hearing echoes of the King James Bible in Milton all over the place. Despite the fact that Milton, by the way, was fluent in the biblical languages. And so, he could actually, read the Bible for himself in the original languages. While he still had his sight, he eventually became blind, and according to the stories that have circulated, whether these are entirely reliable or not, he would then have his daughters read to him aloud the Hebrew Bible in the original, and he would have them sit in a certain place close enough to him so that if they mispronounced the Hebrew or the Greek, he could reach out with a switch and give them a little snap with his switch. We don't know whether that's completely reliable information or not, but it's not totally inconsistent with some of the other things that we're going to see in Milton in terms of his attitudes towards women and his views of the proper relations from his point of view and his culture's point of view of the proper relations between men and women, both in general and more particularly in marriage. But before we get to Milton, I just want to emphasize a few things by way of establishing a context. And if we can go to the tablet once again. I just want to give you a quick rundown of some of the monarchs of England as a way of providing an outline for a discussion of some of the major events in English history. We have, of course, Henry VIII, who makes a break with the Church of Rome at a certain point in his life because he wants to divorce his first wife, Catherine, and marry Anne Boleyn. And the Pope won't go along with this, in part because of the politics of the time involving the King of Spain, who was an enemy of England, but also was related to the Pope, and was lobbying, of course, for the Pope not to grant the divorce to Henry. And so Henry said, okay, then I'm making a break with the papacy and with Rome, and I'm setting myself up as the head of the Church of England. And of course, that becomes really the beginning of the Protestant Reformation officially in England. In some ways, it had already begun, but officially, that's when it begins. And there's the driving of the monks and nuns out of their communities, and the appropriations of the monasteries and monastic lands, and so on and so on and so on, so that the old Catholic Church is to a large extent disestablished at this time. Okay, he is followed by a certain Edward, who is his son, who has a very short reign because he's sickly. And under Edward, there are all kinds of horrible things that occur, partly because Edward, probably was not able to control some of the excesses going on. Who dies and then is followed by Mary. And this is Queen Mary. And this Queen Mary, by the way, comes down to us as Bloody Mary. That's what she was called by her opponents, because Mary was a Catholic. And Mary tried to reimpose Roman Catholicism on England. Well, the Protestant Reformation now had already gone far enough that the Protestants were not going to sit quietly by and be told that they had to convert back to Roman Catholicism. And so they, naturally enough, were resistant, and Mary carried out serious efforts against the Protestants, including heresy trials, public executions, and the like, for which she earned the name Bloody Mary. From her enemies, of course, not from her supporters. And then when she died, there was a real question about the succession, and at first there was a certain Lady Jane Grey who seemed to have the inside track on becoming the next Queen of England, but she was quickly disposed of by the supporters of Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth and I should put down that she's Elizabeth I because the current Queen of England is also an Elizabeth II. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and so as a consequence, when Henry had her brought up, this is his second wife, had her brought up on a charge of heresy and adultery, and had her head cut off, in part so that he could marry yet another one of his 6 wives. He had an act of parliament declaring earlier children by earlier marriages, illegitimate. And under English law, illegitimacy was not simply a slander. It's a technical term for somebody who therefore cannot inherit. And so that was supposed to be done in such a way that Elizabeth then would not have been able to inherit. But then by act of parliament, that law was reversed. And so Elizabeth was declared legitimate, and so she became the Queen of England, with many, many, many supporters who really had had enough of the religious strife going on at that time. And the Protestant Reformation had by this time split into more moderate or even conservative groups who stayed close to the Church of England, which really was not very distant from the old Catholicism, except that they no longer recognized the Pope as the head of the Church of England, but otherwise were very close to Roman Catholicism. And the more radical groups, who increasingly called themselves and came to be called by others Puritans. And the Puritans were English Protestants outside the Church of England who felt that the purifying of the church had not gone far enough. That's where the term Puritan comes from. And they set out to purify the Christian church, not only by breaking with the Church of England, which they felt stayed too close to the Church of Rome, but also by going into churches and they knocked out stained glass windows, they did away with the statuary, they tried to do away with all of the trappings of what they felt was the old and corrupt church, and they tended to build very plain and very simple churches of their own, without what they felt were the adornments of a church that was too close to the practices of the Church of Rome. So in Elizabeth's time, she was able, because she was such a skillful politician, she was able to balance these different forces to a very large extent. She had a rival claimant to the throne who continued for many years to be a rival claimant to the throne, who was Mary, Queen of Scots. And Elizabeth, as you probably know, eventually had Mary arrested, had her imprisoned, and eventually had her executed. Because as long as Mary was alive, Elizabeth did not feel completely secure in her position. Mary had lots of supporters. So, Elizabeth died without marrying and without having any children. And she died in 1603 after a very long and generally peaceable reign, and generally successful reign. The Elizabethan period was a period of great expansion for the English. Not only physical expansion into places like the New World, but also of economic expansion at home and in the colonies abroad. And so the English look back on the Elizabethan period as a kind of golden age. She was followed by James I, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and so he was the King of Scotland, who then was made by Parliament the King of England as well. That had the effect not only of joining Scotland and England, but it also established a certain legitimacy through his mother back to Henry VIII. So you have James the first of England, sixth of Scotland, and his reign became increasingly troubled, especially in his later years. This, by the way, is the King James of the King James Bible. And then his son was Charles I, and the Puritan forces, partly motivated by religion, partly by economic factors, partly by political ambition, rose against Charles I eventually, and in 1643 they were raising their standards against Charles's armies, and of course he was out with his armies to put down the Puritan forces. Already by 1642, the year earlier, the Puritans were powerful enough to force the closing of the theaters. That's a very important date in English literary and dramatic history. 1642, the closing of the theaters by an act of official censorship on the religious grounds that the theaters were not only, as I've mentioned in an earlier class, themselves immoral, but they were sites of immorality. And this is all based on the Calvinist principle. You've heard of Calvin before, right? John Calvin, the French-Swiss theologian, Protestant theologian. And we'll talk more about Calvin and Calvinism later on in connection with Milton. Based on the Calvinist principle that government should be used, and government power should be used to enforce public morality. Public morality. And so you'll notice that during this whole period, there were times when the Puritans were on the outside politically, before the wars actually began. And that's when they came over here. That's when they came over here and established the Puritan colonies, particularly in New England. And then notice when they were on top and the people who supported the king were, you know, on the bottom politically, they emigrated to other colonies, particularly, say, Virginia over here. And various other groups came over to the American colonies, partly identifiable by religion. So that, for example, in places like Maryland, Maryland was largely founded by Catholic emigres. And Virginia was largely founded by Protestant emigres who were loyal to the king and to the Church of England. Various more radical groups went to New England. The Quakers went to Pennsylvania, and so on and so on and so on. So what was going on over in England had a very great impact on what happened over here in the North American colonies. So eventually Charles I loses in the Civil War, and as I mentioned in our earlier segment, in 1649 by an act of Parliament presided over by Oliver Cromwell, sometimes known as Bloody Cromwell, presided over by Oliver Cromwell, the Parliament ordered the King of England to be executed, and so his head was cut off in 1649. And that ushered officially the period of the Commonwealth government in. The Commonwealth government, which was presided over by Oliver Cromwell as the first minister, but the official legislative body was, of course, Parliament. And it was only after Cromwell's death that the Commonwealth government disintegrated, as I mentioned in an earlier segment, and people of almost all political persuasions said, you know, let's bring back the king. Maybe we'll bring back the king on a limited basis and with restrictions on the power of the king, but let's bring back the king and have some semblance of a return to order. And so that's when the elder son of Charles I, Charles II, was brought back in 1660. And this was the restoration of the monarchy, and that whole period is usually referred to simply as the Restoration period in English history. And that, by the way, is also going to have a great deal of influence on things that are happening elsewhere, in Ireland, in Scotland, in North America, and so forth. And we'll touch on some of those things as we go along. also, this has a great impact on John Milton, because Milton was allied with the Puritan forces. You may wonder, why did I get into the wrong class here? Is this a history class or is this a literature class? Well, we have to understand the context within which these people were living, experiencing what they experienced, and writing what they wrote. So in the case of Milton, he was not only a very devout English Protestant, but he also was very closely allied with the Puritans. And he even served in an important government position in Cromwell's government during the Commonwealth period. And by the way, he didn't go along with all of their policies. For example, one person mentioned, are we going to read AEREOPAGITICA? No, we're not going to read AEREOPAGITICA, but let me just tell you a couple of things about it. So if I can go back here and erase my little rundown on the monarchs of England from the tablet, and let me go back to Milton as such. One thing you can say about the Commonwealth government is that it gave the English a taste of a different form of government, a parliamentary form of government. And people never forgot that. And there were those who really wanted to go back to a parliamentary form of government and to strengthen the powers of Parliament vis-a-vis the powers of the king. And so that begins a long process, which of course is continued to the present day, where the reigning monarch in England today has very little actual power, but has a certain amount of symbolic power. But Parliament really is the governing body in the English government, presided over by the Prime Minister, who of course is elected by the members of the House of Commons. Okay, well, let's go to Milton's work just very briefly, AEREOPAGITICA. Okay, AEREOPAGITICA, and what this is a defense of the freedom of expression. A defense of the freedom of expression. And this is often looked upon as one of the classical arguments against state censorship, in which Milton argues his case, interestingly enough, on theological grounds. But that's how people would make convincing arguments. I mean, you think rhetorically about how you are going to try to persuade your audience. Well, if your audience is persuaded by theological argument, then theological argument is the way to go. And so what Milton says is that well-meaning people may want to protect the citizens from what they consider to be immoral influences in books, works of art, and the like. But, Milton argues, a virtue which is untried is no virtue at all. A virtue which is untried is no virtue at all. In other words, if we are never exposed to the possibility of choosing something which is not virtuous, then how virtuous can we be in not making choices like that? You follow the argument? He's saying that if we're insulated from any kinds of temptation, then how can you really call us virtuous, because we've never even known of the possibility of making any other moral choices? Okay, and this becomes a very interesting argument against censorship. So that's a famous work of his, and it's a classic in the defense of freedom of expression. Well, actually Milton is much better known, of course, for the greatest work of his lifetime and one of the greatest works in all of English literature, and that is Paradise Lost. And now if we can go to the PowerPoint, please, which he completed and had published in 1667. And if you've been following my little historical sketch, you will notice that this is 7 years after the restoration of the English monarchy under Charles II. And that means that Milton now is on the outs politically. Okay, remember, he had been an important figure, not the most important figure to be sure, but he had held an important post in the Commonwealth government. So, various kinds of questions come up. The first of which, of course, is going to be the problem of evil. The problem of evil. Now, some of you have probably taken courses in philosophy. Does anybody know what the problem of evil is in philosophy and theology? Well, its classic formulation is what I've put up here on the screen. How can an all-good, all-loving, all-powerful God create a world in which both physical and moral evil exist? Okay? We look around us, and it doesn't take very long for us to recognize that we live in a world in which there are various forms of evil. And philosophers usually distinguish between physical and moral evil. Between physical and moral evil. Physical evil is the fact that we have to suffer from terrible fires, floods, hurricanes, children dying of cancer, you know, all kinds of horrible things, people with terrible deformities and so on and so on. Those are physical evils. Moral evils are the evils that we choose. The evils that we choose. The things that we choose to do to ourselves and to other people, which are genuinely harmful. If I steal from you, for example, that's a case of moral evil, as distinguished from physical evil. Okay, so the basic idea, and this goes back to ancient philosophical discussions, and continues to the present time, by the way. But the basic problem is, how can we believe in a God who has created a world in which there is so much evil and so much suffering? That presumably an all-good, all-loving, and all-powerful God would have created a world without evil and suffering. Because if God is all-loving and all-good, God would want to have created a world in which everything was good. And if he's all-powerful, then such a God would be able to create any kind of a world he wanted to. So how could one believe, given the existence of evil, in a God who is at the same time all good and loving and all-powerful? And the conclusion that is often drawn by people who are atheists and agnostics and whatnot is that we cannot simultaneously believe in a God who is all good and all loving and who is all powerful. Because an all good and all loving God would have made a perfect world. And since the world is not perfect, such a God must not be all powerful. If you believe in a God who is all powerful, then you have to accept that God created the world that we live in. But how does that square with a belief that such a God is all good and all loving? So, This is usually put in the form of a logical dilemma. Now in logic, and I know some of you probably have taken logic, so you know what I'm about to say, but for those of you who haven't, the term dilemma means something much stronger than it does in our usual parlance. You know, sometimes we'll say, oh my God, I'm having a dilemma. Well, that's not what logicians mean by a dilemma. What logicians mean by a dilemma is that you are caught between two alternatives, and either way you go, in effect, you lose. Okay? And so that's the way in which the problem of evil is classically formulated, is as a logical dilemma. Now, how does one get through that? Well, the Orthodox Christian reply is based on insights from St. Paul and his epistles in the New Testament, and St. Augustine, not the Augustine who went to England, but the other Augustine, the Augustine of North Africa, of Augustine of Hippo. And between Paul and Augustine, you have the formulation of what became the Orthodox Christian doctrine of original sin. That is, that it was not God who introduced evil into the world, it was human beings. How? And then, of course, we have the great narrative of the fall, the creation, the placing of Adam and Eve in the garden, and then the temptation, original sin, and the fall. And the punishment which was meted out by God through his archangel messenger, the Greek word, by the way, that comes into the English language as angel, means in Greek, angelos, by the way, means an emissary, somebody who is carrying a message. Okay, so the idea then is that God's not responsible for evil, we are responsible for evil. Now that clearly is going to be the motive behind the writing of Paradise Lost, right? Because that's what Paradise Lost is all about. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint, please. There's a further problem. The Calvinists, who strongly influenced the Puritans in England, many of whom thought of themselves as Calvinists, argued that there was an absolute opposition between predestination and free will. The idea being that if God, being all-powerful and all-knowing, had known from all eternity that humans were going to fall into original sin and then subsequently into other sin, then God would have known this when he created human beings. And did this mean that human beings had free will to choose anything else other than what they did? In other words, were human beings truly free, or were they predestined to fall? And notice the issue here about freedom is moral choice. If you don't have the freedom to choose, can you really be held morally accountable for what you do? In other words, moral accountability depends necessarily on some conception of freedom and of freedom to choose among alternatives. Okay? For example, if somebody holds a gun to your head and tells you to do something which is, let's say, criminal, well, are we going to hold you legally and morally responsible for that? I mean, we could say, well, yeah, he was free to let him the guy blow his brains out. Well, yeah, but what kind of freedom is that? Right? Okay, so that becomes a kind of difficulty. Now, what Milton wants to do is he wants to try to walk a very delicate line down the middle, to allow, of course, for God's foreknowledge, but at the same time to emphasize the ways in which Adam and Eve, and therefore the rest of us, have free will and therefore can make meaningful moral choices. Secondly, there's another complication. How are people justified? The term justification in 16th and 17th century theology, in all the debates between Catholics and Protestants and between Protestants and Protestants, meant this: how are we made just? How are we made just? If we're not all simply damned to hell from all eternity, then how have we been made just? How have we been made good enough to go on to the kingdom of heaven? Luther and Calvin and others stressed God's grace. God simply extends his grace to some and doesn't extend it to others. Who knows why? The ways of God are mysterious. Others, particularly Catholics, but also some Protestants, want to emphasize at least some space in which human merit and human choice can make a difference. Okay? Which way do you go? Well, Milton really, once again, wants to have it both ways as much as he can. As much as he can. Okay? Now, I'm not talking about 21st century religious thinking necessarily. I'm talking about the 17th century now. This is the way the arguments were constructed, and this is how people developed their thinking. And this is classically the opposition between the Pelagians, people who are called the Pelagians, followers of a British monk named Pelagius, and Augustine, who fought against Pelagius and his followers for the last few decades of his life, in the beginning of the 400s or 5th century of our era. What the Pelagians supposedly said, and it's not completely clear what they always said, but what they supposedly said was, if you do your best and live a good life, then God's going to save you. You know, God's going to say, well, you know, he's a good guy or she's a good guy, and therefore, you know, sure, you know, I will bring that person into salvation. Augustine was horrified by that kind of thinking and said, absolutely not. As a result of original sin, we are so distanced from and so despicable to God that it is extraordinary that God may extend to us his grace. But only through his extending to us his grace is it possible for us to get ourselves up on our feet and sort of hobble along. And he uses that kind of analogy or simile. What if you have somebody who can't walk without the help of crutches? And let's say the person falls down and loses his crutches. And the person, no matter how hard he might struggle, can't get up. Not on his own. But then let's say somebody else comes along and helps the person get up on his feet and gives him his crutches, and then he can, you know, make pretty good headway getting along. That's what Augustine said is the case of us in relation to God. Calvin and Luther went so far as to say only very, very small numbers of people are ever among the elect, And so they formed communities of the elect. Like here in America, you know, that was the whole point, you know, is that you had the elect who got on a boat and they came over to to Massachusetts, and in 1630 they founded the colony, say, in Massachusetts Bay, and this was the company of the elect. These were God's chosen people. And they were leaving behind all those sinners who were going to go forever to hell. Okay, that's basically a kind of Calvinist idea. And it's from that idea that they derived the principle that government, therefore, should be for the moral correction and improvement of the people. Calvin's idea of a theocracy. A theocracy. The THEO on the front of theology and so forth comes from the Greek word for God. And a theocracy would not be a democracy. Demos means people, rule by the people. A theocracy means a rule by God. But if God is not directly sitting in front of us, giving out the rules, then who runs the theocracy? Well, it is the elders in the church, okay, who, according to God's laws as they understand them, will impose those laws on the community. So the function in this Calvinist scheme, the function of government, is for the moral correction and improvement of people. And notice there's not only no separation between church and state, there's no distinction between church and state. The state is the church, and the church is the state. Okay, so this is the kind of world in which Milton was growing up, being educated, having some of his early religious thinking, his writing as a poet, his engagement in politics of the time. And these are the kinds of issues that come up over and over again in Paradise Lost. And let's go back to the PowerPoint, please. His cosmology, you know what cosmology means, right? What does the word cosmology mean? It's a branch of physics. What does cosmos mean? Yeah, the universe. I mean, the cosmos is a Greek word for the order of things. It's opposed to chaos, by the way, in Greek. For the order of things. And the cosmos is the whole universe. Okay, not just one single part of it. And you all know what the logy suffix means, tacked onto our words like biology and psychology and so forth. It's from the Greek word logos, which means, in this case, the ordering of knowledge about something. Ptolemy was an ancient astronomer and mathematician who came up with a Ptolemaic, what was called the Ptolemaic system of the construction of the universe. And that put, of course, the Earth at the center, and then you had, as I was mentioning in an earlier class, spheres that circled around the Earth, and those spheres got larger and larger and larger and larger. The first of them was the sphere of the moon. Then there's the sphere of the sun. Then you have some of the planets. Then you have the stars, and so on and so on. And you work your way out, as in Dante, until you get to God, who is on the outside altogether. Now, the way this works is similar to one of those toys that you might have had or seen when you were a child. Did you ever see one of those balls that when you would turn the outer ball, it would impart motion to the ball right inside it, which would impart motion to the ball right inside it, which would impart, and you could take the balls apart, and you take apart the big one, and then it'd be a smaller one, take apart that one, there'd be a smaller one, take apart that, until you get down to the smallest ball of all. That is the Ptolemaic system of the universe. Okay? God's on the outside as the prima mobile, or first mover, and he imparts motion to the outermost of the spheres. And then each one imparts motion to the sphere inside it. There's a little bit of slippage between these spheres, and that is the so-called music of the spheres, which only spiritually elevated people can hear and be inspired by. Earth, sometimes people get the wrong idea. Because Earth is in the center, people think, that meant, that they really thought that Earth was the most important because God put it in the middle. Oh, no, 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 no. Notice that Earth, being in the center of the universe, is the farthest away from God, who is outside the universe altogether. Okay? Earth is the most imperfect part of the universe, and guess where hell is, where the devil dwells, in the center of the earth, which therefore is in the center of the universe. That's what you have in Dante, in Dante's Divina Commedia. Now, obviously, in the 17th century, the whole system of the Copernican notion of the sun being the center and Earth being one of the planets that was circling around the sun was becoming more and more common. However, for poetic reasons, while Milton is an educated guy, knew about this whole Copernican revolution and sometimes uses that cosmology, he also, for poetic reasons, sometimes reverts to imagery from the Ptolemaic system. So you'll find him using both. But again, that's a matter of poetic license in this great work of his. And I've mentioned this here before, that sometimes in the history of literature, when somebody undergoes what we might think of as a failure, Milton's blindness, his being out of political position, provides the opportunity for greatness. And so it did for John Milton. And we'll talk more about this next time.